In the heart of a bustling city square, Sophie, a 10-year-old girl with wide, innocent eyes, found herself at the center of unwanted attention. The square, usually a place of joy and commerce, now buzzed with tension as whispers spread like wildfire. Officer Jack Thompson, a man known for his rigid demeanor and quick judgments, had pointed an accusatory finger at Sophie. He accused her of theft, his voice carrying authority and anger. Sophie, overwhelmed and scared, could barely comprehend what was happening. Her small hands trembled as she clutched the hem of her dress, tears welling up in her eyes. The accusation hung heavy in the air, causing the bustling square to fall into an uneasy silence. People began to gather, forming a circle around Sophie and Officer Thompson. The crowd, initially curious, quickly became judgmental, their eyes narrowing as they scrutinized the frightened girl. Some muttered among themselves, casting suspicious glances, while others simply watched, waiting to see what would unfold. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing to understand how a simple day had turned into a nightmare. Her innocence, so evident to those who knew her, seemed lost on the crowd and the officer. Officer Thompson, standing tall in his crisp uniform, felt a surge of frustration. He had received a report of a theft, and Sophie, unfortunately, fit the description given by a bystander. To him, the situation seemed clear-cut, another young delinquent caught in the act. He was determined to set an example, to show the crowd that justice would be served swiftly. But beneath his stern exterior, there was a flicker of doubt, quickly smothered by years of dealing with criminals. His gaze remained fixed on Sophie, as if trying to force a confession through sheer willpower. Sophie's voice, shaky and soft, barely reached the ears of those around her as she tried to plead her innocence. "I didn't do anything," she whispered, her words drowned out by the murmurs of the crowd and the stern rebuke of Officer Thompson. The world seemed to close in around her, the faces in the crowd blurring into a mass of judgment and disbelief. No one stepped forward to defend her, the fear of opposing the authoritative officer too great. Sophie felt utterly alone, her voice lost in the sea of accusations. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, feeding off Officer Thompson's unwavering stance. A sense of unease settled over the square, a tangible tension that crackled in the air. Some spectators began to doubt, their expressions shifting from curiosity to concern, but none dared to speak up. The officer's reputation for being unyielding was well known, and challenging him seemed unwise. Sophie, sensing the hostility around her, felt her resolve waver. The weight of the accusation was crushing, and she began to wonder if the truth would ever be seen. As Sophie's tears began to fall, streaking her cheeks, the officer's stern expression faltered for just a moment. It was a brief lapse, a flicker of uncertainty that he quickly buried beneath his sense of duty. To him, showing any sign of doubt was a weakness, especially in front of a crowd. He had a responsibility to maintain order, to ensure that justice was upheld. Yet, deep down, something about Sophie's demeanor gnawed at him. But the weight of his badge, and the eyes of the public, kept him rooted in his decision. Suddenly, a hush fell over the crowd as a figure pushed through, parting the sea of onlookers with a calm but commanding presence. It was Michael, Sophie's father, his face a mask of controlled concern. The tension in the square seemed to shift as he approached, his steps deliberate and measured. His eyes met Officer Thompson's with a steady gaze, neither aggressive nor submissive. For a brief moment, the chaos seemed to pause, the crowd holding its breath in anticipation. Michael's arrival was a turning point, though its significance was not yet clear to those watching. Michael's presence immediately had a calming effect on Sophie, who looked up at her father with a mixture of relief and desperation. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his touch grounding her in the midst of the turmoil. Without raising his voice, he addressed Officer Thompson, his tone measured and respectful. "There must be some mistake," he said, his words carrying a quiet authority that contrasted sharply with the officer's earlier aggression. The crowd, sensing the shift in dynamics, watched with bated breath, their judgments beginning to waver. Officer Thompson, caught off guard by Michael's calm demeanor, hesitated for the first time. The certainty with which he had approached the situation began to erode, replaced by a growing sense of unease. The crowd, too, seemed to sense the shift in power, their collective gaze now turning toward the officer, waiting to see how he would respond. Sophie, standing close to her father, felt a flicker of hope. The tide of the situation was changing, but what that meant for her was still uncertain. The square, once filled with accusations, now hung in suspense, waiting for the next move. Michael's calm yet commanding presence seemed to instantly diffuse the tension that had gripped the square. The crowd, which had been on the verge of condemning Sophie, now found itself hesitating. Michael's steps were measured as he approached Officer Thompson, his gaze never wavering. He was not a man to be intimidated, and his very demeanor reflected a quiet confidence. Without raising his voice, he addressed the officer, his words laced with a controlled firmness. "Officer, there's clearly been a misunderstanding," he began, his tone respectful but unyielding. Officer Thompson, who had been so sure of himself moments before, now found himself on the defensive. There was something about Michael's calmness that unsettled him, a stark contrast to the rigid authority he had always relied on. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not in such a composed manner. The crowd sensed this shift, and the murmurings that had supported the officer's actions began to fade. Michael's presence had introduced doubt, not only in Officer Thompson but also in the onlookers who had been so quick to judge. The officer's certainty was crumbling. Sophie, standing close to her father, felt a wave of relief wash over her as she looked up at him. His calm demeanor and reassuring hand on her shoulder grounded her in the midst of the chaos. The fear that had threatened to overwhelm her began to recede, replaced by a glimmer of hope. Michael's words were like a lifeline, pulling her out of the storm of accusations that had engulfed her. She clung to his side, her small frame almost hidden behind his protective stance. The bond between them was palpable, and the crowd began to see Sophie in a different light. Michael knew he had to tread carefully. Challenging an officer in public was not without risks. But he also knew that his daughter's innocence was at stake, and he would do anything to protect her. His voice remained steady as he continued, "Before you proceed with any further actions, I insist that you review the facts." His words were both a request and a command, delivered with the kind of authority that comes from knowing one's rights. The crowd, which had been so quick to judge Sophie, now found itself questioning the officer's actions. Michael's intervention was turning the tide. Officer Thompson, however, was not ready to back down so easily. His pride and reputation were on the line, and he wasn't about to be undermined in front of a crowd. He tried to assert his authority, his voice growing firmer as he responded, "I have a duty to uphold the law, sir. The report I received was clear, and your daughter matches the description given." But even as he spoke, there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. The certainty with which he had acted was beginning to waver, and Michael's calm persistence was eroding his resolve. Michael's gaze never left the officers as he replied, "Descriptions can be misleading, Officer Thompson. My daughter is innocent, and I won't allow her to be falsely accused without proper evidence." His words were a direct challenge, but they were delivered with such measured control that they left little room for argument. The crowd, now seeing the situation from a different perspective, began to murmur in agreement. Michael's refusal to be intimidated was slowly winning them over, and the officer could feel the weight of public opinion shifting against him. The balance of power was changing. Sophie's eyes flickered with a mixture of fear and hope as she listened to her father defend her. She had always known him to be strong and just, but seeing him stand up against a figure of authority like Officer Thompson filled her with a new sense of admiration. The crowd, too, seemed to be realizing that this wasn't just about a simple accusation. It was about justice and fairness. Michael's intervention had introduced a new element to the situation, one that was slowly unraveling the officer's case. The atmosphere in the square was charged with anticipation. As the crowd began to shift in favor of Sophie and Michael, Officer Thompson felt his grip on the situation slipping. The unwavering confidence he had always relied on was being chipped away by the father's calm yet firm insistence on justice. He realized that he was no longer in control of the narrative. The power dynamic had shifted, and the crowd's support was waning. Michael's quiet strength was having a profound effect, not only on the crowd but also on the officer himself. The certainty that had once driven Thompson was now replaced with a growing sense of doubt. Michael knew that he had to press his advantage, but he also knew that pushing too hard could backfire. He decided to appeal to the officer's sense of duty rather than continue to challenge him directly. "Officer, I understand your responsibility to uphold the law, but it's also your duty to ensure that justice is served fairly. I'm asking you to take a moment to consider the possibility that there's been a mistake. My daughter's future is at stake here, and all I'm asking for is a fair review of the facts." His words were measured, designed to appeal to the officer's better judgment. The square fell silent as Officer Thompson considered Michael's words. The crowd, now fully engaged in the unfolding drama, waited with bated breath. The tension was palpable, a fragile thread that could snap at any moment. Sophie, standing close to her father, felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her small shoulders. She knew that her fate rested in the hands of this officer, but she also knew that her father's unwavering support was her greatest strength. The next few moments would determine the course of her life, and the entire square seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Michael's calm demeanor remained unshaken as he sensed the officer's growing uncertainty. He knew that this was the moment to reveal the truth that would shift the entire situation. Taking a deep breath, Michael met Officer Thompson's gaze with unwavering intensity. "There's something you should know, officer," he began, his voice steady and deliberate. The crowd, now fully invested in the drama unfolding before them, leaned in closer. Michael's next words would change everything. With a controlled but firm tone, Michael revealed his identity. "I'm Michael Bennett, civil rights attorney," he stated, his words slicing through the tension like a knife. The name wasn't just any name. It carried weight, a reputation built on defending the innocent and challenging injustices. The crowd gasped collectively, recognizing the name that had often been in the news for high-profile cases. Officer Thompson's face paled as the realization sank in. He wasn't just dealing with any father. He was facing a man who knew the law inside and out. The revelation hit Officer Thompson like a ton of bricks. The confidence he had once held onto now crumbled under the weight of Michael's reputation. He had heard of Michael Bennett, the man who had successfully taken on cases that exposed corruption and fought for the rights of the marginalized. Thompson's earlier resolve now seemed foolish in the face of this new information. His authority, which had felt so unassailable, was now being questioned not just by the crowd, but by his own conscience. The power dynamic had shifted dramatically. The crowd, which had been hesitant to challenge the officer before, now found its voice. Whispers turned into murmurs of disbelief and disapproval directed at Officer Thompson. They had expected a simple resolution to the situation, but Michael's identity added a layer of complexity that none of them had anticipated. The officer, once seen as the embodiment of law and order, now stood on shaky ground. The crowd's loyalty was beginning to shift, aligning itself more with the man who had just revealed his true self. The tension in the square grew thicker. Michael continued, his voice carrying the weight of his years of experience. "Officer Thompson, any wrongful action taken against my daughter will have legal consequences," he warned, his tone devoid of anger but rich in certainty. He wasn't threatening the officer. He was simply stating a fact, one that carried immense weight. The crowd fell silent, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Sophie, standing by her father's side, looked up at him with newfound admiration. She had always known her father was strong, but now she saw him as a protector in the truest sense. The officer's mind raced as he processed the implications of Michael's words. He had been so sure of his actions just moments before, but now everything seemed uncertain. The crowd's shifting attitude, Michael's calm authority, and the potential legal ramifications all swirled in his mind. The decision he had to make was no longer just about a simple accusation. It was about his career, his reputation, and his integrity. Thompson's hands trembled slightly as he realized the gravity of the mistake he was on the verge of making. The situation had escalated far beyond what he had anticipated. As the weight of the revelation settled in, the crowd began to question everything they had just witnessed. The murmurs of disapproval grew louder, some even directing their frustration toward Officer Thompson. The square, once filled with quiet acceptance of authority, now buzzed with the energy of rebellion against an unjust accusation. Michael had not only shifted the focus away from Sophie, but had also turned the crowd into a skeptical jury. The officer, sensing the changing tide, struggled to maintain his composure. His authority was slipping away, and with it, his control over the situation. Michael, sensing that the officer was on the brink of making a crucial decision, chose his next words carefully. "You have a choice, officer," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of everything that had just transpired. "You can either correct this mistake now, or face the consequences later. I'm offering you a way out, a chance to do what's right." The crowd, now fully on Michael's side, waited in tense anticipation. Sophie, clinging to her father's side, could feel the shift in the air. Her fate was in the balance, and it all depended on what Officer Thompson would do next. Officer Thompson stood there, caught between his duty and the overwhelming realization that he had misjudged the situation. The pressure from the crowd, the looming threat of legal consequences, and Michael's unwavering stance left him with little choice. His mind raced, trying to find a way to salvage the situation without completely losing face. The decision he made in the next few moments would define not only his career, but also the trust of the community he was sworn to protect. The square fell into a tense silence as the officer finally prepared to make his move. As the weight of Michael's words settled into his mind, Officer Thompson found himself standing at a crossroads he hadn't anticipated. The authority he had always relied upon now felt fragile, like a thin veneer masking the doubt that gnawed at him. The crowd's murmurings of discontent echoed in his ears, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the icy grip of fear. This wasn't just about enforcing the law anymore. It was about his integrity, his career, and the very essence of who he was as an officer. Thompson's thoughts swirled, a chaotic mix of pride, duty, and an emerging sense of guilt. The confidence he had once held so firmly now felt like it was slipping through his fingers. In the quiet moments that followed Michael's revelation, Thompson's mind drifted back to past encounters, moments when he had acted with the same rigid authority he was known for. Faces blurred together, memories of people he had judged quickly, too quickly, without considering the full picture. He had always prided himself on his decisiveness, his ability to act swiftly in the name of justice. But now, standing in the square with the eyes of the crowd upon him, he began to wonder if he had been too quick, too harsh, too blind to the nuances of human behavior. The doubt that crept into his thoughts was both foreign and unsettling. As he looked at Sophie, standing so small and vulnerable beside her father, Thompson felt a pang of shame. He had been so ready to label her, to cast her as a criminal without a second thought. Her tear-streaked face, her trembling hands, these were the signs of a frightened child, not a hardened thief. Yet, in his zeal to uphold the law, he had almost crushed her under the weight of his own assumptions. The realization stung, cutting through the layers of pride that had built up over years of service. Sophie wasn't just another case. She was a person, an innocent child caught in the crossfire of his unwavering adherence to duty. Michael's calm yet firm demeanor only amplified Thompson's inner turmoil. The father's quiet strength, his refusal to be intimidated, contrasted sharply with the officer's own faltering resolve. Michael's words had been a mirror, reflecting back at Thompson the flaws in his approach, the cracks in his armor. The officer's pride had been a shield, protecting him from the vulnerability of doubt, but now that shield was crumbling. In the silence that stretched between them, Thompson felt the weight of his own shortcomings pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. His chest tightened as he grappled with the reality that he had been wrong. The crowd, once supportive of his authority, had turned into a silent jury, their judgment palpable in the air. Thompson could feel their eyes on him, not with the respect he had once commanded, but with a critical gaze that made him feel exposed. The respect he had worked so hard to earn now felt like it was slipping away, replaced by something far more dangerous: mistrust. The officer's world, once black and white, was now a muddled gray, and he struggled to find solid ground. The realization that he had been about to ruin a young girl's life out of sheer stubbornness was a bitter pill to swallow. As the seconds ticked by, Thompson's mind raced, trying to reconcile the man he thought he was with the man he was becoming. The rigid principles that had guided his actions now felt like shackles, binding him to a path that no longer felt just. He had always believed that upholding the law meant acting with absolute certainty, but now he saw the danger in that belief. It had blinded him to the nuances of justice, to the importance of seeing beyond the surface. The officer's internal conflict deepened, his thoughts a whirlwind of regret, fear, and a desperate need to make things right. Michael's presence, calm and unwavering, was a stark reminder of the path Thompson could choose if he had the courage to change. The father's insistence on justice, delivered with such controlled strength, was a model of what Thompson had always aspired to be. But now, standing at this crossroads, he realized that his version of justice had been flawed, tainted by a need to assert authority rather than seek truth. The officer's heart pounded in his chest as he grappled with the realization that this moment could define him, for better or for worse. The crowd, the square, the entire world seemed to hold its breath as he stood on the brink of a decision. Thompson's thoughts turned to the future, to the consequences of the path he would choose. He knew that admitting his mistake would come at a cost: his pride, his reputation, possibly even his career. But the alternative, continuing down a path of injustice, felt even more unbearable. The thought of Sophie's life being shattered by his actions filled him with a dread that outweighed any fear of personal loss. The officer's internal struggle reached a crescendo as he weighed the options before him, each one carrying its own heavy burden. The realization that true justice required humility, the willingness to admit when one was wrong, began to take root in his heart. Finally, as the tension in the square reached its peak, Thompson knew he had to make a choice. The weight of his badge, once a symbol of his duty, now felt like a chain, binding him to a past he was no longer sure of. But as he looked at Michael, at Sophie, at the faces of the crowd, he felt something shift within him. The officer's pride, once so steadfast, began to give way to something more powerful: the desire to do what was right. Thompson took a deep breath, preparing to make the hardest decision of his career, one that would change not only his life but the lives of those he was sworn to protect. The tension in the square was palpable as Officer Thompson stood at the precipice of a decision that would define not only his career but his very identity. The crowd, once a passive observer, had transformed into a silent, judgmental force, waiting for his next move. Thompson's mind raced, torn between the rigid principles that had guided him for so long and the newfound realization of his own fallibility. He could feel the weight of every gaze, each one carrying its own expectations, its own silent demand for justice. The choice before him was stark: uphold the facade of authority or embrace the vulnerability of admitting his mistake. The stakes had never been higher. Michael's calm, unwavering presence served as a stark contrast to the turmoil raging inside the officer. The father's eyes, steady and full of resolve, seemed to pierce through Thompson's exterior, reaching the man beneath the uniform. "Officer," Michael began, his voice low but firm, "this is your moment to choose what kind of man you want to be." The words hung in the air, laden with meaning. Thompson could feel the truth in them, the challenge they presented. The path of least resistance was clear. Continue with the accusation, assert his authority, and maintain his reputation. But deep down, he knew that this path was tainted by pride, not justice. As the seconds ticked by, Thompson's thoughts turned to the implications of each possible choice. Admitting his mistake would mean a public apology, a display of vulnerability that could tarnish his reputation. In his line of work, where respect and authority were everything, such an admission could be career-ending. Yet, the alternative, condemning an innocent child to protect his pride, felt like a betrayal of everything he had once stood for. The internal struggle was intense, each option fraught with consequences that extended far beyond the square. The officer's heart pounded in his chest, his pulse echoing the urgency of the moment. This was a battle between pride and conscience. The crowd, sensing the gravity of the decision, remained eerily silent. Their earlier murmurs of discontent had faded into a collective hush, as if the very air around them was holding its breath. Thompson could feel their eyes on him, could sense the shift in their perception. He was no longer just an officer enforcing the law. He was a man facing a moral crossroads. The pressure was immense, the weight of public expectation pressing down on him like a physical force. Every instinct told him to maintain control, to assert his authority, but another voice, quieter yet insistent, urged him to choose a different path. A path of humility, of redemption. Michael's words echoed in Thompson's mind, intertwining with his own thoughts, amplifying the conflict within him. This is your moment to choose. The choice seemed deceptively simple. Admit the mistake, apologize, and move forward. But the reality was far more complex, entangled with years of built-up pride, reputation, and the fear of losing everything he had worked for. The officer's mind raced, trying to find a way out, a way to satisfy both his pride and his conscience. But the more he struggled, the clearer it became that there was no middle ground. The time for half measures had passed. It was now or never. Sophie, standing beside her father, watched the officer with wide, fearful eyes. She didn't fully understand the complexity of the situation, but she could feel the tension, the unspoken battle being waged within the man who held her fate in his hands. Her small hand clutched Michael's, seeking comfort and strength in his unwavering presence. She had seen the way her father had stood up for her, how he had remained calm and composed despite the fear and uncertainty. Now, she needed to see that same strength in the officer, needed him to make the right choice, even if she didn't fully grasp what that meant. Her innocence was a silent plea for justice, one that Thompson could not ignore. The officer's gaze drifted from Michael to Sophie, her tear-streaked face a stark reminder of the stakes involved. This wasn't just about him. It was about a young girl's future, about the trust of the community he had sworn to protect. The realization hit him like a wave, crashing over his defenses, eroding the walls of pride he had built around himself. The choice before him was no longer just a professional one. It was deeply personal, a reflection of who he was as a human being. Thompson's breath caught in his throat as he grappled with the enormity of the decision. The crowd waited, the silence pressing in on all sides. As the officer wrestled with his thoughts, the weight of the badge on his chest grew heavier, more burdensome. It had always been a symbol of his duty, his commitment to uphold the law. But now, it felt like a chain, binding him to a version of himself that no longer fit. The uniform, once a source of pride, now felt suffocating, as if it were constricting him, forcing him into a mold he no longer believed in. The pressure to conform, to maintain the image of the infallible officer, was immense. But deep down, Thompson knew that true strength didn't come from maintaining a facade. It came from the courage to admit when you were wrong. Finally, as the tension reached its peak, Thompson knew he could delay no longer. The time for reflection had passed. It was time to act. The officer took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. His decision would not be easy, nor would it be without consequences. But for the first time, he felt a clarity that had been absent before. This wasn't just about following protocol or upholding the law, it was about doing what was right. The path before him was difficult, fraught with uncertainty, but it was the only one that would allow him to live with himself. With a resolve born of deep reflection, Thompson prepared to make his choice. The square was so quiet that even the faintest sound seemed amplified. The rustle of leaves, the distant hum of traffic, and the steady breathing of the crowd, all waiting for Officer Thompson's next move. The moment of decision had arrived, and every eye was fixed on the man who stood at the center of it all. Thompson's chest tightened with the weight of what he was about to do, but he knew that there was no turning back. He had spent years building a reputation, but in this moment, he realized that integrity mattered more than pride. Taking a deep breath, he looked directly at Sophie, her innocent face a beacon guiding him toward the right choice. The officer's voice, when he finally spoke, was steady but tinged with emotion. "Sophie," he began, his voice carrying through the silent square, "I owe you an apology." The words felt heavy on his tongue, laden with the weight of years of authority and the rigid principles he had once held dear. The crowd, initially stunned by the sudden shift, leaned in closer, their collective breath held in anticipation. Thompson continued, forcing himself to meet Sophie's wide, tear-filled eyes. "I was wrong to accuse you without proper evidence, and I'm deeply sorry for the fear and pain I've caused you." The confession was raw, unfiltered, and for a moment, the officer's vulnerability was laid bare for all to see. The crowd's reaction was a mix of shock and admiration, their earlier doubts about the officer giving way to a newfound respect. Thompson's apology was not what anyone had expected, least of all Sophie, who stood rooted to the spot, her tears now falling in earnest. The officer's words had broken through the fear that had gripped her, replacing it with a sense of relief so overwhelming that it left her trembling. Michael, standing by his daughter's side, felt a swell of pride in both Sophie and the man who had found the courage to admit his mistake. The tension that had held the square in its grip began to dissipate, replaced by an air of solemnity and reflection. Thompson knew that an apology alone was not enough. It was only the first step toward making amends. With the crowd still watching, he turned to face Michael, the man whose calm strength had challenged and inspired him to reconsider his actions. "Mr. Bennett," Thompson said, his voice firm but respectful, "I owe you and your daughter more than just an apology. I've learned a valuable lesson today about the responsibility that comes with this badge, and I intend to make things right." The words, though simple, carried a weight of sincerity that resonated with everyone present. The officer's pride had been stripped away, leaving behind only the resolve to be better. Michael, his expression a mixture of respect and understanding, nodded in acknowledgement. He knew that the road to redemption was long and difficult, but he also recognized the significance of Thompson's public admission. "Thank you, officer," Michael replied, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had guided him throughout the ordeal. Acknowledging the mistake is the first step, but it's what you do next that will truly matter. The exchange was brief but powerful, a moment of mutual respect between two men who had found common ground in the pursuit of justice. The crowd, sensing the shift in dynamics, began to murmur their approval, the tension giving way to a sense of closure. Sophie, still clutching her father's hand, looked up at Thompson with a mixture of confusion and gratitude. The officer, who had moments before seemed so imposing, now appeared almost human, fallible, yet willing to make amends. The fear that had gripped her heart was slowly being replaced by something else, something unfamiliar: forgiveness. She didn't fully understand the complexities of the situation, but she knew that the man standing before her was trying to make things right. In her own small way, Sophie found the courage to nod at Thompson, a gesture of acceptance that spoke volumes. Thompson, seeing Sophie's hesitant nod, felt a wave of emotion wash over him. The simplicity of her gesture, a small, almost imperceptible acknowledgement, held more meaning than any words could express. It was a sign that, despite everything, there was still a chance for redemption, a chance to rebuild the trust he had so nearly destroyed. The officer's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and resolve, and for the first time in a long while, he felt at peace with his decision. The journey toward earning back the trust of the community would be long, but this was a start, and in that small nod from Sophie, he found the strength to begin. The crowd, once a silent jury ready to condemn, now stood as witnesses to an unexpected act of humility and redemption. Their initial doubts about the officer had been replaced by a cautious optimism, a hope that maybe, just maybe, change was possible. Thompson's public apology, his willingness to admit his mistake, had struck a chord with them. It wasn't often that they saw someone in a position of power display such vulnerability, and it left an impression that would not soon be forgotten. The square, which had been a stage for conflict, now felt like a place of reconciliation. The atmosphere had shifted, and with it, so had the perception of those involved. As the moment of redemption came to a close, Thompson took a step back, his shoulders lighter than they had been in years. The crowd, still processing the events that had unfolded, began to disperse, their murmurs carrying a mix of reflection and respect. Sophie, now feeling the warmth of her father's hand, allowed herself to breathe a little easier. Michael, too, felt the weight of the moment, knowing that this was not just a victory for his daughter, but a victory for justice, for doing what was right. Thompson, watching the crowd slowly drift away, knew that the hardest part was yet to come, living up to the promise he had made, both to Sophie and to himself. In the days that followed the incident in the square, Officer Thompson found himself reflecting deeply on the events that had transpired. The public apology, the humbling experience of admitting his mistake, had left a profound impact on him. He had spent years as a rigid enforcer of the law, believing that authority and justice were synonymous. But now, he understood that true justice required more than just following the rules. It required empathy, understanding, and a willingness to see beyond the surface. Thompson knew that he could no longer be the officer he once was. A change had begun within him, one that would alter the course of his career and his life. Determined to make amends and rebuild the trust he had nearly destroyed, Thompson took the first steps toward transforming his approach to policing. He began by reaching out to the community, attending local meetings, and engaging with residents in a way he never had before. It was a slow process, met with some skepticism, but Thompson was patient. He knew that trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. It had to be earned, one day at a time. The officer found himself listening more, understanding the concerns of the people he served, and realizing that being a good cop wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about serving the community with compassion and fairness. One of the first people he approached was Michael. Thompson sought him out, not as an officer seeking approval, but as a man seeking guidance. The conversation was candid and honest, with Thompson expressing his desire to learn from his mistakes and become a better person. Michael, true to his nature, responded with grace and encouragement. He offered to introduce Thompson to community leaders and suggested ways in which the officer could become more involved in initiatives that promoted justice and understanding. The bond between the two men, forged in the heat of conflict, began to grow into a genuine partnership aimed at bettering the community. As the weeks turned into months, Sophie's life began to return to normal. The trauma of the accusation still lingered, but with her father's support, she began to heal. Michael ensured that Sophie understood the importance of forgiveness, teaching her that people could change and that redemption was possible. Sophie, wise beyond her years, took these lessons to heart. She saw the efforts Officer Thompson was making to change, and though the fear she had felt that day in the square would never fully leave her, she began to see him in a new light. The man who had once been her accuser was now someone she could respect. Thompson's transformation didn't go unnoticed by the community. Slowly but surely, people began to acknowledge the change in him. He was no longer the officer who simply enforced the law with an iron fist. He was becoming a protector, a guide, someone who cared about the people he served. His efforts to connect with the community, to listen and learn, began to pay off. The mistrust that had once shadowed him started to dissipate, replaced by a cautious optimism. Thompson knew that he still had a long way to go, but he was committed to the journey. Each small victory, each person who began to trust him again, was a step in the right direction. One of the most significant changes in Thompson's life was his decision to work closely with Michael on community projects. The two men, once adversaries, became collaborators in a shared mission to foster understanding and justice. They organized events that brought the police and the community together, creating spaces for dialogue and collaboration. Thompson found that these interactions were not only beneficial for the community, but also deeply fulfilling for him personally. He was no longer just a law enforcer. He was a bridge builder, someone who could help mend the divides that had once seemed insurmountable. The work was challenging, but it gave Thompson a renewed sense of purpose. Sophie, too, played a role in the new beginning. Inspired by her father's example and by the changes she saw in Officer Thompson, she began to speak out about her experience. With Michael's guidance, she shared her story at community events, emphasizing the importance of justice, forgiveness, and the power of change. Her words, delivered with the innocence of a child, but the wisdom of someone who had seen both the best and worst of people, resonated deeply with those who heard them. Sophie's courage became a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was always the possibility of a new beginning. The relationship between the police and the community, once strained, began to heal. Thompson's efforts, along with the collaboration of community leaders like Michael, fostered a new era of cooperation and mutual respect. The programs they initiated, ranging from youth outreach to conflict resolution workshops, began to take root, creating a foundation for lasting change. The square, once a place of tension and fear, became a symbol of this new beginning. It was a place where people could come together, not just to resolve conflicts, but to celebrate their shared commitment to justice and peace. For Thompson, the journey was far from over, but he embraced it with an open heart. The lessons he had learned, the importance of humility, the power of redemption, and the value of community, became the guiding principles of his life. He no longer saw his badge as a symbol of authority, but as a reminder of his duty to serve and protect with compassion and integrity. The man who had once stood rigidly behind the law now understood that true justice was about more than rules and regulations. It was about people, about understanding their struggles and standing with them, not against them. Thompson's redemption was not just a personal victory. It was a new beginning for everyone involved. As the months passed, the events that had unfolded in the square became a story that the community would tell for years to come. A story not just of conflict and redemption, but of the deeper lessons that lay beneath. For Officer Thompson, the journey had been one of profound personal transformation. He had started as a man defined by rigid adherence to authority, but through the humbling experience of admitting his mistakes, he had come to understand the true essence of justice. It wasn't about wielding power or enforcing the law with an iron fist. It was about empathy, understanding, and the willingness to see the humanity in others. This realization had changed the course of his life, guiding him toward a new path. Michael, too, reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this point. He had always believed in the power of justice and the importance of standing up for what was right, but the experience with Officer Thompson had reinforced these beliefs in a way he hadn't anticipated. Watching the officer's transformation, seeing the way he had embraced humility and sought to make amends, had given Michael a renewed sense of hope. It was a reminder that change was possible, that even those who seemed entrenched in their ways could find redemption if they were willing to confront their flaws. Michael's faith in humanity, which had never wavered, now felt stronger than ever. Sophie's perspective, though shaped by the trauma she had endured, also reflected a deeper understanding of the world around her. She had witnessed the power of fear and prejudice, but she had also seen the strength of forgiveness and the possibility of change. The experience had taught her that people were capable of both great harm and great good. and that it was important to judge others not by their worst moments, but by their capacity to grow. Sophie's innocence had been tested, but in the end, it had emerged intact, tempered by a newfound wisdom. She carried these lessons with her, a quiet strength that would guide her through life. The community, once divided by mistrust and fear, began to heal in the wake of these events. The story of what had happened in the square became a symbol of what could be achieved when people chose to see the humanity in one another. Thompson's public apology, Michael's unwavering stand for justice, and Sophie's courage had all played a role in bridging the divide. The programs and initiatives that had been started in the aftermath continued to flourish, bringing together people from all walks of life. The square, once a place of conflict, was now a place of unity, a testament to the power of understanding and reconciliation. Thompson's journey, however, was far from over. The lessons he had learned would stay with him for the rest of his life, guiding him in his continued efforts to serve the community with integrity and compassion. He knew that the path of redemption was a lifelong one, filled with challenges and opportunities for growth. But he was no longer the man he had once been. He had changed, and with that change came a deeper sense of purpose. Thompson's story became an example for others, a reminder that it was never too late to choose a different path, to embrace humility, and to seek forgiveness. Michael's role in the community also evolved as a result of the events in the square. He continued to work alongside Thompson and other leaders, advocating for justice and equality. The partnership that had begun in conflict had blossomed into a powerful alliance, one that sought to create lasting change in the community. Michael's belief in the power of dialogue and understanding became the cornerstone of their efforts, helping to build bridges between the police and the people they served. The lessons he had imparted to Sophie about forgiveness, justice, and the importance of standing up for what was right now formed the foundation of their work. For Sophie, the events in the square became a pivotal moment in her young life. She had learned that the world could be unjust, but she had also seen the power of standing up for the truth. Her father's example, and the changes she had witnessed in Officer Thompson, had shown her that people could change, that mistakes could be corrected, and that justice was something worth fighting for. Sophie's experience became a source of strength for her, a reminder that she had the power to make a difference. She knew that her voice mattered, that even as a child, she could inspire others to do what was right. As the community moved forward, the story of the square became a shared memory, a lesson in humanity that transcended the individuals involved. It was a reminder that we are all capable of both error and redemption, that our actions can have profound effects on the lives of others. The lessons learned from that day continued to ripple through the community, influencing the way people treated one another, the way they approached conflict, and the way they understood justice. The square, once a site of division, had become a symbol of unity, a place where people could come together to reflect on the power of forgiveness and the importance of seeing the humanity in others. In the end, the story of Officer Thompson, Michael, and Sophie was not just about one man's redemption or one family's struggle for justice. It was a story about the capacity for growth and change that exists within us all. It was a story about the importance of humility, the strength of forgiveness, and the enduring power of humanity. The lessons learned in the square that day would continue to shape the lives of those involved, serving as a reminder that no matter how deep our flaws, we are all capable of choosing a better path. And in that choice lies the true essence of justice and the hope for a brighter future. As the story of Officer Thompson, Michael, and Sophie comes to a close, we are reminded of the powerful lessons that have emerged from their experiences. The journey from conflict to understanding, from rigid authority to compassionate justice, is one that resonates deeply within all of us. It's a story that shows us the importance of humility, the courage it takes to admit when we are wrong, and the profound impact that forgiveness can have on our lives. Thompson's transformation from a man bound by pride to one guided by empathy serves as a testament to the human capacity for change. Michael's steadfast dedication to justice and Sophie's quiet strength remind us that true power lies in our ability to see the humanity in others. This story isn't just about the characters you've come to know, it's about all of us. It's a call to action to reflect on our own lives, to consider how we treat those around us, and to remember that justice isn't just about following the rules. It's about doing what is right. The square where this story began has become a symbol of unity, of what can happen when we choose to stand together, to listen, and to learn from one another. The lessons learned here are timeless, and they are as relevant today as they ever were. If this story has touched you, if it has made you think about the importance of empathy, understanding, and justice in your own life, I invite you to take action. Share your thoughts in the comments. How did this story resonate with you? What lessons will you carry forward? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that challenge us to think deeply about the world we live in. And if you feel moved to support the creation of more content like this, consider contributing through the Buy Me a Coffee link in the pinned comment. Your support helps bring these stories to life. Stories that remind us of the power of change, redemption, and humanity. Thank you for watching, and remember, the journey toward justice and understanding is one that we are all on together. Let's continue to learn, grow, and make the world a better place, one story at a time. Please let me know if this conclusion and CTA meet your expectations, or if there are any adjustments you'd like to make.